The Trident, Chapter 1. The Planetary Anomaly. The void of space stretched endlessly, a black canvas speckled with distant stars. Slowly, a ship emerged from the darkness, its sleek form cutting through the emptiness like an ancient spearhead. The vessel bore a single name inscribed along its hull, the Trident, an eternal ship, gliding through the cosmic expanse with an unyielding purpose: to seek, to discover, to archive. Unlike the countless ships that had come into existence, those built by civilizations bound to the passage of time, the Trident was eternal. It had no manufactured origin in the known universe, no birthplace in the stars. It existed because it was meant to exist, moving between galaxies like a silent witness to creation itself. The ship was the remnants of creation, unique with crew that was unlike any other in the universe. They each were chosen by the Creator in a time of desperation long ago in the cosmos. The cosmos was on the brink of losing all life, and the Creator needed to take action. The last galaxy that had life on it was soon going to come to an end, so the Creator did the one thing they hoped to never need to do. The Creator intervened with the physical cosmos. The universe that makes up all existence, including the Creator, is bound to the laws of energy. Even an infinite amount of energy that is eternal cannot be divided up into smaller infinities. Infinity only exists in two ways: as eternal energy and the absence of energy or total nothingness. The eternal energy that formed into the physical material by the Creator came from his divided up energy into the cosmos. Even though he was eternal, he could not use this eternal energy to grow his creations infinitely. Or in other words, his infinite eternal energy could not create something eternal with the same amount of eternal energy. Knowing this, the Creator knew what he was giving up when he intervened with life in the physical cosmos that he created. In desperation to not let all life go extinct, he went forth and saved 3 lives from the last galaxy with living life forms left on it. These 3 would go on to become the crew of the Trident, the once mighty staff that the Creator held with him during the time of creation. His Trident became a ship of eternal design, and inside, the crew, each with a special gift given to them by the Creator. Due to the Creator's actions of saving their lives, he was now bound to never interact with anything in the physical cosmos ever again, and he knew that would become of him for doing what he did, so he gave them a specific purpose on the Trident. He tasked them to do what now he could not, to physically roam the cosmos seeking out all details of what was created, archive all living and non-living material in the cosmos. The Trident had infinite storage capacity for archiving the cosmos. It would become a historical library of all record in the universe. The Trident came into existence at a time after the last galaxy had perished and life in the cosmos had re-emerged again, at which time the Trident would begin its eternal mission given to them by the Creator. Because the Creator had extremely little capabilities to be allowed to interact with the Trident and its crew, he forged a being that had no birthplace, no living connection to the cosmos, for he was the commander of the Trident, the one that was given the background of the Trident's purpose, but because his duty and purpose was for the Trident, he was given no memory of the universe or the Creator themselves. He only knew of his reason for existence, and that was to be the one to inform the Trident and crew what their purpose was. And it was to make an entire historical record of everything in the cosmos that they would need to physically travel to. This again was due to universal energy laws they were all bound to. Since the dawn of creation, after the first plant life came into existence, the Trident with its mission appeared, and knowing their purpose began exploring the cosmos, carrying out their eternal mission bound to them by the Creator. Inside the ship, the crew stood at their designated stations, each one engaged in quiet, calculated observation. They were not like the explorers of mortal worlds. They did not age, did not hunger, did not falter. They were eternal, created for one singular purpose: discovery. Formed not by evolution or chance, but by design. The great Creator, an unseen force beyond the laws of universal physics, had assembled them to be his presence among the stars. He could not directly interfere with the cosmos, bound by the very laws he had set in motion, but his creations could. At the heart of command stood the Commander, the first of them. His presence alone commanded absolute authority, not through fear or force, but through sheer experience. He alone bore the full knowledge of their existence, why they had been made, why they could never be more than what they were. He had seen more of the universe than any living being, yet even to himself, his past was a mystery. If he had existed before the Trident, he could not remember. He did not question it. He only moved forward. Seated at her station was Amara, the living material analyst, scanning planetary data feeds with methodical precision. Her abilities allowed her to perceive life, even across vast interstellar distances. A mere glance at a planet's biosignature could tell her if it housed intelligent beings, primal organisms, or nothing at all. Yet, for all her knowledge, she could not determine what made life anomalous, why some life forms developed abilities beyond the natural order, while others remained ordinary. That, above all, was what she sought to understand. To her right, Lyrian, the physical material analyst and archivist, pored over mineral readings. Unlike Amara, his focus was on the non-living, on the composition of planetary crusts, the molecular structures of asteroids, the density of neutron star remnants. He could break down, manipulate, and reconstruct material in ways no natural force could. He had studied the strongest elements the universe had to offer, yet there was one force beyond even his control: black hole matter. To him, it was the one true enigma, the one material he could never command. And now, an anomaly unlike any they had encountered lay before them. Finally, there was the navigator, seated in the pilot's chair, his expression unreadable as his mind focused beyond what any mortal eye could perceive. He did not see the universe as others did. To him, outside his direct field of view, there was no light or darkness, no empty space, only matter in motion. Solid, liquid, gas, he could detect them all in real time, guiding the Trident with impossible precision through the ever-shifting currents of the cosmos. Yet, for all his sight, he was blind to life. He could not see the creatures that walked upon planets, could not sense the presence of intelligence or emotion. To him, the universe was a landscape of objects and motion, nothing more. Above them all, woven into every system of the Trident, was Elysium, the ship's artificial intelligence. It did not sleep, did not waver, did not err. It processed, observed, calculated. It was the mind of the Trident, ever present, ever aware. The mission was clear. They would roam the stars eternally, seeking out anomalies, unraveling the mysteries of creation, preserving the knowledge of the cosmos. And now, they had found something new. Ahead of them loomed a dwarf-sized planet, but its surface did not behave as it should. Space itself rippled around it, like a fractured reflection on the surface of water. The terrain shifted subtly yet unmistakably, boulders vanishing, only to reappear elsewhere, landscapes fluctuating as if reality itself could not decide their shape. It was an impossibility. The laws of physics did not allow for such things. And yet, it was happening. The commander stood at the observation deck, his gaze locked onto the swirling distortions. His voice was calm, but the weight of curiosity and unease lay beneath it. "We've encountered many anomalies," he muttered. "But nothing like this." Amara studied the data before her, frowning. No life detected. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her tone, an uncertainty that did not belong. "The surface is barren." Lyrian leaned forward, scrutinizing the geological scans. "Just rock and mineral composition. But whatever's causing this instability isn't normal. I need a closer look." The commander gave a single nod. "Take the navigator with you. You'll need his sight." The navigator exhaled, shifting his stance. "Understood." The descent to the planet's surface was uneventful, but the moment their boots touched the ground, something felt wrong. Gravity was present, yet inconsistent, fluctuating ever so slightly, like a tide shifting beneath their feet. The terrain was jagged yet fluid, as though the ground itself resisted being defined. Boulders the size of the Trident hung eerily in midair, their movement slow and deliberate. Some would vanish entirely, only to reappear in a different location an instant later. Others swapped places in the blink of an eye, as if space itself had folded, exchanging them like puzzle pieces. Lyrian crouched, running a gloved hand over the terrain's surface. His scanners activated, feeding information directly into his mind. "Mostly silicate," he murmured. "But there's something else, something that defies normal behavior." Even the tiniest of pebbles were interacting in the same fashion as the rest of the planet. They were teleporting around as far as Lyrian could see with this first initial scan. The navigator remained motionless, his visor flickering as he scanned the environment. He could see it, the way the planet shifted, the way objects moved not at random, but with purpose. His voice was quiet but certain. "They're not just teleporting," he murmured. "Some of these boulders, they're switching locations. Trading places." Lyrian's head snapped up, intrigued. If there's a pattern, it means something is controlling it. The navigator's vision adjusted, locking onto a disturbance invisible to the naked eye. He saw it then, the faintest flicker of energy, an electric charge building between the displaced objects. "Some of them are charging," he said suddenly. Back aboard the Triden, Elysium's voice cut through the comms. "Warning, static charge buildup detected. Discharge is imminent." Lightning split the air. The navigator tensed. "Lyrian, look out." Out! A violent shockwave erupted. Lyrian barely had time to react before an electrical discharge struck the ground near him, sending him tumbling backward. And then, a deep hum filled the air. The space around the navigator shimmered. Distortions rippled outward. Lyrian forced himself upright just in time to see a brilliant white-blue flash explode around the navigator, consuming his form entirely. And then, he was gone. Silence followed. Back aboard the Trident, an alert flared across Elysium's interface. "Navigator displacement detected. Unable to track location. No real-time positioning available." The commander stood frozen, his voice unnervingly calm. "He's gone." Lyrian clenched his jaw. His mind raced. "No, not gone. Displaced." He exhaled sharply, his voice steady but filled with something new, something close to urgency. "Just before the surge, the navigator informed me that the planet's material was exchanging places with itself." The commander's gaze hardened. "Lyrian, I want you to analyze that anomaly. Figure out exactly what happened. We need to know where he went." Lyrian's eyes darkened with determination. "Find him. No matter what it takes." Chapter 2: A World Unknown, Expanded Version. A gentle rustling sound stirred the navigator from unconsciousness. His body, still attuned to the cold sterility of the Trident, was now pressed against something damp, something organic. The sensation was foreign, almost unsettling. Slowly, he opened his eyes. A dense canopy of towering trees loomed above, their branches entwined in an intricate dance, allowing only fragments of golden sunlight to pierce through. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the crisp tang of vegetation, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. For a moment, he remained still, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible truth. He was no longer on the anomaly. The hum of the Trident, the quiet, regulated atmosphere of the ship, the reassuring voices of his crew, all of it was gone. Instinct kicked in. He shifted, pushing himself upright. A sharp pain flared in his ribs, forcing him to brace against the rough bark of a nearby tree. He took slow, controlled breaths, assessing his condition. His gear remained intact, his right arm flickered as he activated his internal systems. A holographic display materialized before him, a floating screen of soft blue light. He commanded his navigation system to locate the Trident. The screen flickered. Then, nothing. No coordinates. No connection. No indication that the Trident even existed in this space. A cold realization sank into his chest. I am completely alone. He then expanded his gear to include more quadrants of the cosmos into his display. After expanding his field of view many times, he finally located the Trident. It was at a far distant location way beyond his range of communication with the crew. For the first time since the beginning of his mission, he was lost in the cosmos. Suppressing the rising panic, he turned his attention to the forest around him. The trees were massive, their trunks ancient and gnarled. Their leaves shimmered faintly, reflecting hues of violet and emerald under the fractured sunlight. Strange, bulbous fruits dangled from thick vines, some pulsating faintly as if alive with energy. Every element of the environment was rich, thriving with an overwhelming abundance of life. Yet, despite the presence of organic matter, something was wrong. His scanners detected no familiar biological markers. The molecular structures of the plant life were entirely foreign, their composition defying known classifications. Even Amara wouldn't recognize these, he thought grimly. His eyes flickered upward, scanning the sky beyond the canopy. The sun or what served as one glowed a deep amber, larger and more intense than Sol. A second, smaller celestial body hovered nearby a pale blue moon, locked in an eternal waltz with the golden star. This was not an ordinary planet. The realization sent a wave of unease through him. Where am I? Then, a sound. Distant. Rhythmic. The unmistakable cadence of galloping hooves. The navigator tensed, shifting his stance. He moved behind the trunk of a tree, his movements measured and precise. He listened. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady and deliberate. Whoever was approaching wasn't wandering, they were moving with purpose. Moments later, she appeared. A young woman on horseback, her long brown hair flowing behind her, wearing a cloak of earthy tones that blended seamlessly with the forest surroundings. She pulled the reins sharply, bringing her horse to a halt the moment she spotted him. Her hazel eyes widened in shock. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. "And how did you get here?" The navigator hesitated. If this planet was pre-space flight, she wouldn't understand concepts like anomalies, displacement, or interstellar travel. He had to choose his words carefully. "I woke up here," he admitted, keeping his voice measured. "I don't know how." Her eyes narrowed. "Where's your horse?" she asked. "There's no way you could have gotten here on foot, not this deep into the forest." She gestured behind her. "It's days from the nearest settlement." "I didn't walk," he said cautiously. "And I don't know how to explain it." She scowled, clearly not satisfied with his answers. "Well, you'd better figure out how to leave," she said, flicking the reins. "By nightfall, you'll be lost for good. This place, it swallows people whole." Before he could respond, she kicked her horse forward, galloping away. The navigator stood in silence, watching until she disappeared into the trees. Then, slowly, he exhaled. The mystery of where he was remained unanswered. But now, at least, he had one certainty. He was not alone. Chapter 3. Building Trust. Expanded version. Edits applied. Days passed. The navigator remained in the forest, his presence unchanged. He neither ate nor drank, his eternal form sustained by the energy bestowed upon him by the Creator. Yet, he spent his time observing, studying the intricate balance of this unfamiliar world. The trees were ancient, their bark woven with glowing veins, faintly pulsating like a heartbeat. The air carried a strange hum, almost imperceptible, as if the entire forest was alive with whispers. Though he could not analyze biological data like Amara, he could observe patterns. And the patterns told him. This place was unlike any world he had ever encountered. The young woman returned near the planet's time of sunset approaching. This time, she approached cautiously, curiosity overcoming her initial skepticism. The fading sunlight cast golden hues across the trees as she rode forward, scanning the area. Then, rounding a bend, she spotted him. "You're still here?" she asked, dismounting. Her voice carried a mix of disbelief and concern. "How are you still alive?" The navigator met her gaze evenly. "I have experience in survival," he replied. "I have explored many forests before. The reason I'm still here is simple: I don't know where I am." I was displaced in an accident aboard my ship, and somehow I ended up here. The woman frowned. Displaced, she echoed. The night before you appeared, there was a terrible electrical storm. The worst we've ever seen. Lightning struck all over the valley and mountains. You're saying that had something to do with you being here? It very well could be, he admitted. I would return to my ship and crew if I knew where I was. But I have never been here before, and I don't know what direction to take. She crossed her arms, skepticism still lingering. You can't be out here alone. There's no way anyone could survive 2 days without food or water. The navigator hesitated for a fraction of a second, then responded carefully. There is no one else with me. And this place is alien to me, different from any world I've ever encountered. Her lips quirked into a smirk. Alien, huh? She said, tilting her head. So, what does that make you? An alien? He considered her words before answering, maybe. But right now, all that matters is figuring out how to get back home. For a moment, she studied him, a flicker of suspicion and intrigue crossing her face. Then, finally, she sighed. You'd better come with me, she said. If you're really lost, you won't last out here much longer. She turned to her horse and reached for the reins. Then it happened. A sudden movement from above. A snake fell from the high branches, landing on the horse's back. The horse reared violently, panicked. Karen barely had time to react before it bolted, galloping into the darkness of the forest. And oh, she shouted, running after it. Come back. But the horse was already gone. Karen stood there, breathless and shaken, staring into the depths of the trees. The navigator approached calmly. Where did your horse go? He asked. Karen turned to him, frustration and fear in her eyes. He ran back home and left me here, she muttered, shaking her head. If I don't make it back to the clearing before nightfall, I'll be lost out here forever. A cool breeze swept through the trees, carrying the distant sound of howling. The temperature was already beginning to drop. The navigator nodded, taking a step forward. Then I'll take you to the clearing. Karen blinked at him. We won't get lost, he continued. Trust me. She folded her arms. You don't even know where you are. How are you going to navigate through this forest, 25 miles away without a map or a compass? My compass, she added, was in the saddlebag on my horse. The navigator simply raised his arm, the holographic map illuminating the darkness. Karen's eyes widened. With this, he explained, my navigation system archives planetary landscapes as I travel. It mapped this forest the moment I arrived. Karen took a step closer, watching in awe. The soft blue glow of the projected map traced every tree, every incline, every landmark. That's incredible, she whispered. The navigator turned to her, his voice steady. Stay close. As long as you are with me, you won't get lost. Karen hesitated for a moment. Then, finally, she nodded. Okay, she said, her voice softer than before. Find the path to the first marker. The navigator turned his attention back to the glowing map, adjusting their route. The first marker should be about 10 miles from here, Karen explained. It's a group of large, dark gray stones that fell from the mountains and settled on the valley floor. She glanced upward, then back at him. The trees here are too thick. We won't be able to navigate by the stars. Without a compass, how do you know we're going the right way? The navigator offered a faint smile. Because my guidance system doesn't rely on magnetism for direction. Together, they began their journey through the darkness. As the night deepened, the forest came alive, a symphony of insects, rustling leaves, and distant nocturnal creatures. The only source of comfort was the soft glow of the navigator's map, illuminating their path. For the first time since her horse bolted, Karen felt a flicker of hope. Chapter 4. The First Marker, Expanded Version. The forest thickened as night fell, its towering trees casting eerie shadows over the uneven ground. The only source of light was the faint blue glow of the navigator's projected map, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The further they walked, the denser the darkness became, the thick canopy completely blocking out the stars. Karen glanced at him occasionally, suspicion slowly fading into cautious trust. She had always relied on her father's compass to find her way through the dense foliage, and yet, this strange man seemed to have his own way of navigating, one unlike anything she had ever seen. "How does that thing on your arm work?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. The navigator hesitated, his gaze fixed ahead. "It was given to me," he said, "by the one who assembled my ship and crew. We were provided with the tools to travel anywhere in the universe." Karen frowned. "Then why did you get lost here?" The navigator exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not lost," he corrected. "My ship and crew are lost without me. I have no way of reaching them. They are too far for me to establish a link. So for now." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I am stuck here." Karen studied him for a long moment. Something about him felt different. She still wasn't sure if she fully believed him, but he had guided them flawlessly so far. After a pause, the navigator gestured toward the map. "We're approaching the first marker," he said. "It should be just ahead." Karen narrowed her eyes, scanning the darkness. Then, she spotted them. A cluster of large, jagged stones rose from the forest floor, their dark gray surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Her eyes widened. "That's it," she murmured. "The first marker. You actually found it." The navigator turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "I told you," he said, meeting her gaze. "You won't get lost with me." They rested briefly at the marker. Karen leaned against one of the stones, sighing as she caught her breath. "I never thought we'd actually make it here," she admitted. "Why is this a marker for navigation?" the navigator asked. "They look like some random rocks that slid down the mountain." "These rocks are special," she replied. "You see, these rocks are magnetic. They broke off the side of the mountain, the part of it that is made of magnetic rock." "Magnetic rock, you say?" said the navigator, intrigued. "Yes. I use my father's compass to detect these rocks and navigate myself around this part of the forest," she said. "Any idea how long the mountains have been magnetic?" he asked. "No telling," Karen replied. "But what I do know is that these mountains came long before the forest did." "How do you know?" "My father dated the age of the most ancient trees and dated the magnetic rock of the mountains, and he concluded that the mountains must be older." "Sounds like an intelligent man, your father," said the navigator. Karen smiled faintly. "Yes, you two would get along well since both of you are very into navigation." The navigator, now with some clues about the landscape around them, had a new objective: to talk with this girl's father about the magnetic mountains. She pointed behind one of the rocks. "There's a small stream just over there. The water is safe to drink. We should refill before moving on." She kneeled beside the stream, cupping the cool water in her hands and drinking deeply. The navigator hesitated. He didn't need water. His body didn't require sustenance, but Karen didn't know that. If she realized how different he was, it might terrify her. So, without a word, he mimicked her actions, pretending to drink. Karen smiled slightly. "See," she said. "Not bad, right?" The navigator nodded, saying nothing. As they prepared to leave, Karen turned to him. "Wait," she said suddenly. "I don't even know your name." The navigator paused. "Names don't mean much where I'm from," he replied. Karen raised an eyebrow. "That's convenient," she said, smirking. "But I'm not letting you off the hook. I have to call you something." The navigator considered this for a moment. "Well," he said, "I am a scout for my ship." Karen tilted her head. "A scout." She tested the word on her tongue, then snapped her fingers. "How about Scott?" The navigator blinked. "Scott?" "Yeah," she said with a grin. "Short for scout. It fits you." The navigator hesitated, then gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "Scott it is." A faint smile crossed his face. "And what do I call you?" he asked. "My name is Karen Shepard," she said softly. "It's nice to meet you, Scott." The navigator, now Scott, nodded in return. They continued their journey through the forest, pushing forward through the darkness. For the first time, Karen's shoulders relaxed. The weight of fear lifted from her. They were almost to the clearing. Chapter 5: Passing Through the Clearing, Expanded Version. After 2 hours of walking through the dense forest, Scott suddenly stopped. He raised his arm, the soft glow of his projected map illuminating Karen's face in the darkness. "Here," he said, pointing to their position. "We're only a few hundred yards from the clearing." Karen let out a relieved sigh, glancing ahead. "I can't believe we actually made it this far. You really can navigate through anything, huh?" Scott tilted his head. "I was built for it." Karen looked at him curiously. "How do you even know which direction is which?" she asked. "With all the magnetic interference from the mountains, regular compasses don't work properly here." Scott frowned slightly. "Magnetic interference?" he repeated. Karen had spoken of this before, and he had a hunch that it might be connected to his displacement. "Please tell me more about it." Karen nodded. "Yeah, the mountains surrounding this valley are made of magnetic rock. My father handcrafts special compasses that help us navigate through it. Without them, you'd be completely lost." Scott's mind raced. Magnetic mountains? That was new information and possibly critical. "My gear doesn't rely on magnetism," he explained. "It operates on self-mapping AI guidance. When I first arrived, it automatically scanned the area and built a model of the terrain. That's why I can navigate through this forest even with no stars visible." Karen nodded slowly, processing the information. "Huh," she murmured. "So, the mountains don't affect your tech?" "Apparently not," Scott said, but internally, he was already running dozens of calculations. This was a lead, something he needed to investigate. Karen, unaware of his thoughts, continued walking. "My father says these mountains are ancient," she said. "Older than the trees, older than anything else in this valley. No one knows exactly how they formed, but they've been here for as long as our family has." Scott followed her, absorbing every word. Ancient magnetic mountains. A valley surrounded by anomalies. Could this place be more than just a random displacement point? They stepped into the clearing. For the first time in hours, the forest canopy gave way, revealing the open sky above. Karen looked up, relieved to finally see the stars again. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Scott barely reacted. His gaze was fixed on the stars too, but for a very different reason. He was searching. Looking for any sign of the Trident, for any recognizable constellation, for any clue that would tell him where he was. But the stars were completely unfamiliar. This wasn't just a different system. He was in a completely unknown sector of the universe. Scott clenched his fists. He had never been truly lost before. But this time he was. Karen interrupted his thoughts. "Looks like we're heading back into the trees," she said, pointing to the dense forest ahead. Scott nodded, pushing his emotions aside. "How far until the next clearing?" "About 10 miles, Karen said. "That's where my home is." Scott extended his map projection, the blue glow casting shadows on the trees ahead. Karen watched him carefully. "I really hope you know what you're doing," she said quietly. "Because without my father's compass, we're relying on you now." Scott looked at her, his expression unwavering. "I give you my word," he said. With nothing more to say, the two of them stepped back into the shadows of the forest, leaving the clearing behind. Chapter 6: The Shepherds, Expanded Version. As the horizon shifted, the dense forest canopy gave way to rolling hills of deep green. Karen paused, inhaling sharply. "There it is," she murmured, relief evident in her voice. Scott followed her gaze. Nestled within a cluster of ancient oaks, a modest wooden home stood in the valley below. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, and rows of plants and small orchards stretched around the property, thriving under the twilight sky. Karen's pace quickened. The exhaustion from their long journey seemed to vanish. "Come on," she called back, motioning for Scott to follow. "You should meet my family. They'll want to know who you are and how you helped me." Scott hesitated for the briefest moment. This was a critical interaction. The first real contact he would have with more of this world's inhabitants. He had to be careful. As they descended toward the home, a sharp bark rang out. A large shepherd dog bounded forward, its tail wagging furiously as it greeted Karen with excited yelps. "Hi, Max," she cooed, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "I'm home. And this." She glanced at Scott. "Is Scott?" The dog sniffed in his direction but kept its distance, staying firmly by Karen's side. Scott watched. Animals had instincts that humans didn't. If this creature reacted strangely to him, it could raise suspicions. After a few tense seconds, Max simply sat down, watching Scott cautiously. Karen smiled. "Looks like he's not sure about you yet." Scott nodded. "That makes two of us." Before Karen could reply, the front door creaked open. A tall man with broad shoulders stepped onto the porch. His face, weathered from years of labor, softened as he spotted his daughter. "You're late, Karen," he said, his voice a mix of concern and sternness. "We were worried." Karen waved off his concern. "I'm fine, Dad. Thanks to Scott." Her father's gaze shifted to Scott, his expression unreadable. "Oh," he mused, "and where exactly did you find my daughter?" Scott met his eyes, choosing his words carefully. "In the forest. She lost her horse, so I guided her home." The man crossed his arms. "The forest is unforgiving at night. There was no moon. No way to navigate the terrain." Scott nodded. "I have ways of navigating that don't rely on moonlight." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's so? Where exactly do you come from, Scott?" Karen interjected quickly. "Dad, don't grill him. He's a navigator, from a ship. He got lost in the storm the night before last." Her father's expression didn't change. "The closest ocean is on the far side of the city, beyond the mountains," he said, his voice skeptical. "So tell me, son, how does a sailor end up 40 miles inland?" Scott hesitated. This was it. He couldn't lie completely, but he couldn't tell the full truth either. "There was an incident," he said carefully. "I was displaced from my ship by something or someone. I have no idea how I got here, and I don't have any way to communicate with my crew. If I can learn more about where I currently am, I might be able to find my way back." The man studied him for a long moment. Then, his expression softened slightly. "Well then," he said, extending a hand. "Name's Samuel Shepherd." Scott took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Scott," he said simply. Samuel nodded. "We appreciate what you did for Karen." He gestured toward the door. "Come inside. You can rest here for the night." As they stepped into the house, the warmth of crackling firelight wrapped around them. The scent of freshly baked bread and herbs filled the air. From the kitchen, a woman appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Karen," she gasped, rushing forward to pull her daughter into a tight hug. "You were supposed to be back hours ago." Karen sighed. "I know, Mom. But Scott helped me get home." Her mother turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you for bringing my daughter back safely," she said sincerely. "Please sit down. You must be hungry." Scott hesitated. He didn't need to eat, but refusing would only raise questions. So, he simply nodded and took a seat at the wooden table. Karen's mother set a plate of food in front of him, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and dried meat. Scott picked up a piece of bread, studying it for a moment before taking a small bite. It was strange. The act of eating was something he rarely did, yet mimicking the behavior allowed him to blend in. As they all settled in, conversation flowed. Scott listened carefully, absorbing details about their way of life, their history, their struggles. But inside, his mind was already at work. The magnetic mountains. The storm the night he arrived. The anomaly back on the Trident. These things weren't coincidences. He had pieces of a puzzle, but no clear picture yet. Scott fed a small piece of his bread to Max, subtly avoiding eating too much himself. As the night wore on, one thought remained firm in his mind. "I need to find out why I was brought here." Chapter 7. The Shepherd's Gift, Expanded Version. Scott sat at the edge of the shepherd's garden, his mind still preoccupied with the magnetic mountains and the mystery of his displacement. The valley, though serene, held secrets he was only beginning to uncover. Yet something about this place lingered in his mind, something beyond the mountains and their strange properties. He could feel it, though he couldn't yet define it. Karen approached, carrying a woven basket filled with ripe fruit. "You look like you're trying to solve the universe's biggest mystery," she said, handing him a piece of fruit. "You're allowed to take a break, you know." Scott took the fruit, studying it before looking at her. "I don't require rest like you do." Karen rolled her eyes. "You say that, but you act like a man carrying too much weight." Scott considered her words, but said nothing. Instead, he held up the fruit, observing it. "Everything in this universe eventually decays," he mused. "Even the stars have lifespans. Life, no matter how unique or miraculous, will one day cease to exist. My crew's mission is to seek out these rare life forms and preserve them in our archives before they disappear." Karen raised an eyebrow. "You talk about life like it's fragile." Scott nodded. "Because it is. My crew has found civilizations on the verge of extinction, species no longer able to sustain themselves. It is our duty to document them before they are gone forever." Karen glanced at the fruit in his hand. Not all life fades so easily. Before Scott could ask what she meant, she reached into the basket and retrieved another fruit, one that was shriveled, blackened with decay. Without hesitation, she cupped it in her hands, closing her eyes. A soft, golden glow emanated from her fingertips, wrapping around the fruit like delicate threads of light. Scott watched, his breath stilling as the fruit began to change. Tiny sparks of static electricity danced along the surface, crackling as they surged through the decayed fruit. The blackened exterior softened, the decay retreating as if time itself was reversing. The skin grew smooth, its color shifting from dull brown to a vibrant red. In mere moments, the fruit was restored, fresh and full of life. Scott's eyes widened, his analytical mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. "That isn't possible," he murmured. Karen smirked and handed him the now revitalized fruit. "It is here." Scott turned the fruit over in his hands, inspecting every detail. There were no seams, no evidence of tampering. It was as if the decay had never existed. He glanced up at her. "How did you do that?" Karen sat beside him. "It's a gift," she admitted. "Something passed down through my family. My father has it, my grandmother had it. We can restore life, plants, crops, even the land itself." Scott's mind raced. This was no ordinary ability. It was something far greater, something unprecedented. He had seen countless civilizations, countless biological phenomena, but nothing like this. This was the anomaly the Triden had been searching for. His heart pounded as realization struck. The unique life form they had been tasked to find and archive wasn't just the valley or its strange ecosystem. It was Karen and her family, their bloodline. Scott closed his hand around the fruit. "Your family has always had this ability?" Karen nodded. "As far back as we can remember. It's why we live in this valley, because the land is special and we were meant to protect it." Scott exhaled, his grip tightening around the fruit. The urgency of his situation magnified. He wasn't just stranded on an unknown world, he had found something his crew had spent an eternity searching for. And if he didn't return to the Trident soon, this knowledge would be lost forever. He looked at Karen. "I need to get back to my ship." Karen frowned. "You still don't know how, do you?" Scott shook his head. "Not yet, but I have to figure it out." He glanced toward the mountains, where his next destination awaited. "And I think I know where to start." Karen studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you'd better hurry. Storm season is coming soon. Once the lightning starts, the mountains become too dangerous to cross." Scott barely heard her. His mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan. He had to uncover the mystery of the mountains. He had to find a way back. Because for the first time in his endless existence, Scott had discovered something truly irreplaceable. And he wasn't going to lose it. Chapter 8. Mystery of the Magnetic Mountains, expanded version. The morning sun had barely risen when Scott found himself standing at the edge of the shepherd's land, gazing up at the towering peaks that surrounded the valley. The mountains were unlike anything he had seen before, jagged, unwavering, and imposing. They felt unnatural. Something about them didn't belong. Karen approached, following his gaze. "You're really interested in those mountains, huh?" Scott didn't look away. "There's something about them. I just can't figure out what yet." Karen smirked, crossing her arms. "Well, you're not the only one who thinks they're strange. My father's been studying them for years." Scott turned to her, intrigued. "Studying them?" She nodded. "Yeah, you'll want to talk to him. He's in his workshop, probably making another compass." Scott followed Karen to the wooden structure behind the house. Inside, the scent of wood shavings and iron filings filled the air. Tools and scraps of metal lined the walls, and at the center of the room, hunched over a workbench, was Samuel. "Dad," Karen called. "Scott has questions about the mountains." Samuel didn't look up right away. "Figured he would," he muttered, tightening a screw inside a compass casing. Scott stepped forward. "Karen said you've been studying them." Samuel exhaled, setting his tools down and finally looking up at Scott. "I don't study them. I observe them. There's a difference." Scott nodded. "What have you observed?" Samuel leaned back against the workbench, folding his arms. "For one, they're old. Older than the valley. Older than the trees. I don't know where they came from, but whatever created them happened long before anything started growing here." Scott's mind raced. The mountains predated the forest? That meant they weren't a natural part of the valley's evolution. "What else?" Scott pressed. Samuel studied him for a moment, then walked over to a wooden chest. He pulled out a small, worn map and spread it across the workbench. Scott leaned in, eyes scanning the carefully drawn lines marking the valley and the surrounding mountains. "I make compasses," Samuel continued. "But a normal compass won't work here. The mountains are highly magnetic. So I use the metal from the peaks to make specialized ones." Scott's attention sharpened. "You craft the compasses from the mountains themselves?" Samuel nodded. "The material is unlike anything else on this planet. I've tested every mineral I could find, and nothing reacts the way this does. It tends to make its own magnetic poles shift and dance around, sometimes randomly, but in the same locations, and these compasses use that magnetic rock as their heading needle and always point to where the energy has shifted last." Scott's mind was already making connections. The shifting of the magnetic poles in the rock could be signs of temporal displacement, but without Lyrian, he couldn't know for sure. "And the rocks at the first marker?" he asked, remembering the large stones they had rested by during their journey through the forest. Samuel nodded. "Those came from the mountains long ago. Pieces that broke off and settled in the valley over time. They're made of the same magnetic material. If you want to study what those magnetic rocks are made of that make up the peaks of the mountains, your best bet would be to start there." Scott inhaled slowly. The rocks at the first marker were fragments of the mountains. If they were the same material as the peaks, then their properties were key to understanding the anomaly that brought him here. Samuel walked back to the workbench and picked up an unfinished compass. He held it out to Scott. "Take this with you." Scott took the device, feeling its weight in his palm. The craftsmanship was impressive, but what truly interested him was the material itself. "If you want answers, start with the fragments," Samuel said. "Follow the patterns. You'll start seeing what I've seen." Scott tightened his grip on the compass. He now had a clear direction. First, he needed to examine the fallen rocks at the first marker. Then, he would explore the magnetic mountains themselves. He had a feeling they were hiding something far bigger than anyone here realized. And he was going to find out what. Scott thanked Samuel for the compass and that he was going to go investigate the mystery of the magnetic mountains come sunrise. Samuel replied, "Normally, I would tell others to travel through the forest with extreme caution, but with one of my compasses and your navigational skills, I think you'll find your way through the forest just fine, Scott." Then as dawn came the next day, the navigator went out on his journey to investigate the rocks at the first marker and the mystery of the magnetic mountains. Chapter 9. Exploring the Magnetic Mountains. Scott stood at the edge of the valley, his gaze fixed on the towering mountain range that had become the center of his investigation. The compass Samuel had given him twitched erratically in his hand, its needle shifting unpredictably, not pointing north, but toward the mountains themselves. He activated the map projection from his arm, overlaying the terrain with real-time data. The strongest magnetic points were emerging in a structured pattern. This was no random formation. The mountains had been arranged or shaped by forces far beyond natural geology. Scott climbed the rugged slopes, the erratic compass in hand. As he marked the peaks, his theory solidified. These mountains were remnants of something far older, perhaps an impact that altered the planet's structure eons ago. And more importantly, the material within them was identical to the anomaly aboard the Triden. A realization struck. The storm on the night of his arrival had activated this material. It hadn't just displaced him, it had exchanged him. And if that was true, he could reverse it. Scott's heart pounded as he looked toward the horizon. Dark clouds churned, lightning flickering in the distance. The storm was coming. Then an idea struck him. If he could channel the storm's lightning to hit the peaks of the mountains again, maybe he could recreate the conditions that triggered his displacement back on the planetary anomaly on the other side of the cosmos. Now he had his plan. Before the storm reached the valley, he moved quickly, planting lightning rods at the highest peaks. If the storm's energy interacted with the magnetic material at the right moment, it could recreate the conditions of the first displacement, hopefully taking him back to the other side of the cosmos and reuniting him with his crew and the Triden. Meanwhile, aboard the Triden, Lyrian sat hunched over his station, reviewing the energy signatures from the anomaly's remains for what felt like the 100th time. The material's readings remained perplexing. It didn't behave like anything they had previously encountered. The anomaly's material doesn't just disappear, Lyrian murmured to himself, fingers tapping against the console. It isn't vanishing, it's moving. He cross-referenced all the recorded instances of its destabilization. Every surge, every fluctuation, it was all linked to specific disruptions in the anomaly's field. The realization struck him like a bolt of electricity. Exchange, he whispered. It's not just phasing in and out of existence. It's swapping places. He straightened, eyes narrowing. If the material was exchanging locations rather than simply dissolving into nothingness, then whatever had happened to the navigator wasn't random. He had been sent to a place where this material already existed. And if that was the case, the navigator was beyond the ship's detection range, not lost, but simply out of reach. Lyrian turned sharply to the commander. I think I know where he is. The commander regarded him impassively. Explain. Lyrian pulled up the energy graphs, highlighting the shifting coordinates. The anomaly's fragments don't just displace. They trade places with other fragments of itself orbiting the planetary anomaly. During the incident, there were power surges that could have triggered an exchange displacement with another piece of this material that could have broken off and physically traveled to wherever the navigator is now. The navigator didn't vanish. He was exchanged. The only reason we couldn't find him is because the location he was sent to was beyond our scanning range. Without his ability to pinpoint locations, we had no way of detecting it. The commander observed the data in silence, then gave a slow nod. If that's true, we may be able to force a second exchange. If we trigger the same conditions as before. Exactly, Lyrian confirmed. We create the anomaly's reaction again, but this time, we focus on drawing him back instead of sending anything else away. The commander turned toward the ship's central display. Then let's begin preparations. Let's bring him home. Back in the valley. Scott braced himself against the wind as the storm intensified. The first lightning bolt struck the peak, sending a surge of energy through the valley. The rods amplified the charge, creating a chain reaction across the magnetic field. At that same moment, the Triden initiated its surge, attempting to recreate the conditions of the first displacement that had sent the navigator away. But this time, the energy surges were more powerful. The lightning strikes against the valley charged the anomaly's material past the critical displacement point, causing a surge of displacement energy to surround the Trident, and in a blinding flash, the Trident had vanished. Chapter 10: The Pain of Loss, Expanded Version. Scott's heart leaped as he saw the Trident materialize in a brilliant flash of energy, emerging from the fold of displaced space. His fist shot into the air in triumph. "We did it." But his celebration was short-lived. Something was wrong. The energy field didn't stabilize. Instead, it began to unravel, spreading out across the valley floor, feeding off both the rift and the electrical storm's energy. The very ground shuddered beneath Scott's feet. Cracks spidered across the rock, glowing with an eerie blue-white light. Scott's breath hitched. The entire planet was destabilizing. Back aboard the Trident, alarms blared through the command deck. "Elysium, locate the navigator, now," the commander shouted. A second later, the AI's voice cut through the commotion. "Navigator detected, northwest quadrant, 42 miles from Central Valley. Lock onto him." Acknowledged. Initiating teleportation sequence. "Amara, Lurian, scan and archive any and all life you can before this planet is lost. We've got one shot at this." "Aye, sir," they both responded, swiftly activating their instruments, desperately working to preserve what little life remained on the collapsing world. Scott felt the familiar hum of the Trident's transport field wrapping around him just as the ground beneath him gave way. His body lifted into the air, weightless, as the valley crumbled beneath him. In that final moment before being pulled away, his eyes locked onto the valley below. Karen stood in front of her home, looking straight at him. The land beneath her split apart. The shepherd's home, their legacy, crumbled in an instant, swallowed by the abyss. Then she was gone. Scott materialized onto the Trident's deck, collapsing onto his knees as the ship trembled from the aftershocks of its arrival. The crew stood frozen, their eyes locked on the main viewport, watching in stunned silence as the planet fragmented before them. Scott's voice was barely a whisper. "No." He forced himself up, stumbling toward the console. "Elysium, scan for life signs. The valley, scan the valley." A pause. Then, the AI's response. "Negative. No remaining life detected in the valley region." The words struck him harder than anything he had ever endured. Scott's breath came in uneven gasps, his vision tunneling. He had escaped. But they hadn't. Karen, Samuel, their home, their lives. The room froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Scott's chest rose and fell sharply, his hands still clenched. No one spoke. Until Elysium's voice broke the silence. "Genetic archive secured." Scott's head snapped up. "What?" The AI continued, its tone calm and precise. Before planetary collapse, Lyrian and Amara successfully completed genetic scans of all known life forms, including human-like inhabitants. Scott's heart pounded. He turned to Lyrian, desperate. "Tell me you saved them." Lyrian's face was grim. "Scott, we gathered biological samples. DNA, cellular structures, but we didn't know what we were looking at." Scott's breath caught. "You mean you don't know if you saved them?" Lyrian shook his head. "We don't know who those samples belong to. We scanned everything before the collapse." Scott's chest tightened. It wasn't the same. A copy of something wasn't the thing itself. "They're gone forever now. I'll never see them again," Scott murmured as he dropped the compass Samuel had given him onto the metal floor of the Trident. Lyrian and Amara stood at his side, watching as the planet's remains crumbled into the void. "Scott." Amara's voice was soft, uncertain. But he didn't look at them. He couldn't. Instead, he turned his gaze to the empty space where the valley had been, where they had once existed. Amara, recognizing that the navigator had just gone through a terrible loss, picked up the compass he dropped and took it back to her workstation. She returned a moment later and kneeled down in front of Scott. "As long as you remember them, my navigator, they will never truly be gone," she said, placing the compass around his neck in a necklace she had fashioned for him. They were truly one of a kind in this universe, and on behalf of this entire crew, we thank them for saving our navigator and bringing him back to us. The silence on the bridge was deafening. Scott finally lifted his head. His expression was unreadable, his breathing still uneven. The rest of the crew watched, waiting for his next action. His breathing hitched, the weight of loss crashing down on him. Never before had he felt this kind of pain. It was unpredictable, uncontrollable. For the first time in his existence, he didn't know what to do. No one spoke. The crew turned toward the viewport. Where the planet once was, there was now only empty space. The weight of what had just happened sank into their bones. Amara clutched the console, looking sick. Lyrian ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched so tightly it might snap. The commander stood frozen. Scott, still on his knees, whispered to himself. What now, my divine creator? What do we search for now after we've lost something so irreplaceable? Then, a voice, not from the ship, not from the crew, but from everywhere. A presence filled the bridge. An ethereal, boundless force, gentle, yet powerful. The creator. The universe is designed to create constantly. New and unique life forms are always emerging. Though the loss of this unique family is a tragedy and can never be recreated, there is always something new and unique waiting to be discovered. I urge you all to continue the mission. Explore what more this vast universe has to offer. Farewell, crew of the Trident. And Godspeed. A long silence followed. The crew, heavy with grief, turned to each other. Scott unlocked his gaze from the viewport, his hands still shaking. But resolve began to settle in his eyes. He looked up at the commander, then at Lyrian, then Amara. Let's go, he said softly. The commander gave a small nod. Scott turned to the viewport, whispering one final goodbye. I will never forget you, Karen. Then, he activated his navigation console, plotted the next course, and said aloud for all to hear. Let's see what else is out there. The Trident then soared back into the endless cosmos.